This is a picture I sent to one of my friends back home with the caption, "This is where I am right now." I felt like it characterized my first few weeks in Japan. This is a surprisingly blurry picture of my first time seeing Akihabara. This is a picture of two people who are not very immersed in their environment while walking around Tokyo Station. And this is a picture of two people very immersed in their environment walking around Tokyo Tower. This is a picture of the top of a temple near the Sumida River. And this is a picture of a train station in Meguro City. And finally, as you might recognize, this is a picture of Mitaka Station. You are probably wondering why I'm showing you all of these pictures, but I have my reasons. Do I want to show you some cool pictures from my time in Japan? Sure, I guess. Or do I want to show off my photography skills? Well, if I did, I would have chosen some better pictures, huh? You see, the real reason I wanted to show you all of these pictures was to highlight something I couldn't ignore since I got to Japan. Tenji Blocks. And since I don't want to look at you when I talk to you, sorry, if I was a Tenji Block, I would be this one. I first noticed Tenji Blocks as soon as I got out of the airport in Narita. The Tenji Blocks lined the station platform, like in this picture I was showing you earlier. But in the following weeks, I found I couldn't ignore the Tenji Blocks. I was amazed with how persistent they are, lining seemingly infinite hallways. Every time I felt the tactile paving under my shoes, I was more infatuated with them, wondering why they were so prevalent here in Japan, where Tenji Blocks were from, and most importantly, where they could take you. Eventually, this infatuation led me here, to this video. So before I geek out more about my personal experiences with Tenji Blocks, I want to give you something to work with. To start, let's define what a Tenji Block really is. The word Tenji Block translates from Japanese literally to braille block. In English, you might hear them referred to as tactile paving, which is equally as boring as it is inaccurate. Tenji Blocks come in a large variety of designs, sometimes as paving worked into the brickwork of a street, but also very often as plastic tiling or metal strips and nubs fastened directly on top of the pavement. They are usually yellow to help the visually impaired with some vision find them, though sometimes they are matched to the color of the concrete to complement nearby landscaping and architecture. But although they come in many varieties, for the most part, they are all the same shapes and sizes. This uniformity allows blind people to recognize them and distinguish them from anything else they might notice with their canes, wherever they may be. Finally, there are two types of Tenji Blocks, as you can see in this picture. The first type, with a 5x5 grid of small truncated raised domes, acts as a warning for blind people. When they reach these blocks, they know either to be careful or that they're at a point of interest, such as a map or a bus stop. The second type, with 4 parallel bars, indicates to blind people that there's a path that they are safe to proceed on. They often begin and end with the warning blocks. Now it's time for a brief history, brief enough that I saved time for my favorite part at the end of the video. Tenji Blocks were invented in Japan, which is part of the explanation for why they're all over the cities here. In the early 1960s, an inventor in the Okayama prefecture named Seiichi Miyake noticed the passing cars in dangerous crosswalks and wondered how his visually impaired friend Takeo Iwahashi would navigate the rapidly developing streets of Japan on his own. Inspired by Braille, Seiichi thought of a way the visually impaired could navigate based on distinct tactile markers on the ground. In 1965, he invented what I used to call a bumpy square, and what others might call a blister pattern or raised semicircles, or for those who actually know what it's called, a Tenji Block. Convincing the Japanese government to put these blocks all over their country was slow work, and at first, there was no work. But after solidifying some prototypes, in 1967, the first Tenji Blocks were finally laid down at the crosswalk near the Okayama Prefectural School for the Blind. 3 years later, the government started to allocate money for Tenji Blocks to be laid down in train stations both in Tokyo and Osaka, some of the biggest and busiest cities in the world. It was a combination of the visually impaired and their community members concerned for their safety that prompted the government to build more and more structure for the visually impaired. By 1985, Tenji Blocks were mandated for broad use across Japan. Finally, in 2001, there was a study done suggesting that 5 by 5 for the warning tiles and 4 parallel bars for the directional tiles was the new national standard for Tenji Blocks. This standard eventually spread to other countries. Now, Tenji Blocks are practically everywhere, at every train station in Japan, and are required to be installed by any contractors building a space larger than 2,000 square meters. Japan's disability-focused 2006 Barrier-Free Act is yet another form of support that helps ensure blind people, as well as people with other disabilities, can access public spaces. The future of Tenji Blocks is also looking bright, literally. A company called Hirobe Koki Co. is making glow-in-the-dark Tenji Blocks, which are both supportive infrastructure for the blind and warning strips for the sighted. There is another company, NaviLens, which tackles the biggest problem I have with Tenji Blocks. Even if you can follow the paths, you don't actually know where you are going unless you are familiar with the route via experience or planning. NaviLens is developing tactile paving with QR codes built into them, which can provide directions at each warning block, allowing blind people to, in a way, explore. I saw something similar to this near Shibuya, but when I tried to scan the QR code, it just came up as a math problem, and not even a fun one. But unfortunately, Tenji Blocks paths are beginning to fall apart. Since Tenji Blocks are literally trampled on by people every day and sometimes are outside enduring the elements, they need to be replaced as often as every decade. In certain locations, like this one, navigating Tenji Blocks seems like a mini-game for the visually impaired. And sometimes, the paths make no sense at all. Additionally, updating other infrastructure or building new buildings causes problems for Tenji Blocks. Sometimes they aren't replaced, and sometimes their function is completely ignored and the paths are blocked. And you know, Tenji Blocks have some other problems too. They're full of problems, but rather than complain about them, I'm going to take you on a tour. Follow me. We're going to Shibuya. As soon as I left my dorm's front door, I was on Tenji Blocks, and the path was relatively easy to follow. There were a few intersections where I only knew which direction to turn because I had been here before and can see. But my biggest problem was, when I arrived at the wrong bus stop, I noticed there wasn't any braille to let me know. The buses were pretty easy too. A lot of information is spoken out loud on the loudspeaker, and each stop is announced long before you get there. It sounds like this. I knew getting off the bus was going to be a problem from my past experience. You might notice, or not notice, the Tenji Blocks on the ground, because there were none there. I had to walk all the way onto the sidewalk to find any. Then I went up the stairs and was greeted with a nice wide path. But part of me wonders why this path is so wide and not the standard width. It's not like it's accommodating more than one blind person at a time. Before we move on, I want to shout out Tenji Blocks' best friend. Tenji Blocks often lead to points of interest, as I mentioned earlier, and one of these points that is especially important for blind people are Braille maps, which can be found at many city train stations, as well as in places like public restrooms. Back to the tour. The trains were easy. Just like the bus, each station's announced well before you get there. It was only when I got to Shinjuku Station and Shibuya Station when I realized the most apparent problem with Tenji Blocks, which might be the biggest problem in Tokyo. There are just so many people. It's so busy. Even if there's a sufficient amount of Tenji Blocks in place, crowds often hoard the hallways and trample the infrastructure or whatever. I don't know, I don't care. I do care actually, but this is the end of the tour, so I really appreciate you guys coming with me. that's it from me. Thanks for watching. Sources. 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 Self-promotion. I don't know. I don't know why I do anything anymore, man.